The wind, a cruel, unseen blade, scoured the last vestiges of warmth from the cabin. Alara huddled deeper into the threadbare quilt, the rough wool offering scant defiance against the biting cold that seeped through the chinks in the logs. Outside, the world was a canvas of unforgiving white. The pines bowed under the weight of snow, their branches creaking like old bones. Days bled into weeks since the last whisper of her husband's name had echoed in the empty space, swallowed by the silence of his never returning. He'd gone for supplies, for news, for anything that might ease the gnawing hunger that had become a constant companion. Now only the hunger remained, a dull ache that had sharpened into a desperate clawing in her gut. She was alone, truly irrevocably alone. The axe, leaned against the rough-hewn wall near the empty hearth, felt too heavy for her trembling hands, its purpose a stark reminder of the wood that needed felling, the fire that refused to spark from damp kindling. Fear, a cold tendril, coiled around her heart, tighter with each passing hour. It wasn't just the cold or the emptiness of her belly, but the vast, indifferent wilderness pressing in, a monstrous more ready to consume what little hope remained. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with a splintered piece of pine, trying to coax a flame, but the wood was stubbornly wet. A dry cough rasped in her throat, the air thin and sharp. She had not wept since the first week. Tears felt like a luxury, an extravagance of moisture her body could no longer afford. Every breath was a conscious effort, every beat of her heart a small, defiant drum against the silence of a world that seemed determined to forget her. Just as despair threatened to finally break through her fragile resolve, a sound, distinct from the wind's wail, pricked the air. A muffled crunch, then another, rhythmic and deliberate. Her eyes, wide and disbelieving, fixed on the single window, its pane of frosted canvas. A shadow detached itself from the gloom of the forest, moving with a ponderous, steady gait. It was a man, cloaked in thick furs, his silhouette broad and formidable against the snow. He carried something long over his shoulder, a rifle, her breath caught, frozen in her lungs. Another human. In this desolation, a man could be salvation or something far worse. Her hand instinctively reached for the closest thing resembling a weapon, a heavy iron poker, its cold metal a shocking jolt against her skin. The crunching stopped. A moment of absolute stillness. Then a knock, heavy and unhurried, vibrated through the cabin's very timbers. Alara did not move. She simply stared at the door, the poker a futile weight in her grip. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing, broken only by the relentless whisper of the wind outside. Then, another knock, firmer this time, followed by a low, guttural voice that sliced through the quiet. Anyone alive in there? It was rough, weathered like bark. Not the voice of a man accustomed to polite company. Her mind raced, a frantic scramble for options she didn't possess. To open it was to invite the unknown. To refuse was to succumb to the cold, to starvation. Survival, she knew, often demanded a desperate gamble. Slowly, her stiff fingers uncurled from the poker. She moved with painful deliberation, each creak of the floorboards sounding like a clap of thunder in the small space. Her hand hovered over the latch, cold steel beneath her fingertips. With a surge of desperate courage, she unbarred it, pulling the heavy door inward just a crack. The cold air rushed in, bringing with it the scent of pine, wood smoke, and something wild venison. The man filled the doorway, a towering presence. His face, shadowed by the brim of a wide, snow-dusted hat, was a landscape of weathered lines, a thick beard crusted with ice. His eyes, though, were what held her. They were a startling, clear blue, direct and unervingly perceptive, devoid of malice but equally devoid of warmth. He held a freshly killed deer slung over his shoulder, its dark fur contrasting sharply with the pristine snow. "Heard a cough," he said, his gaze sweeping over the cabin's meager interior, lingering on the empty hearth, then on her, assessing. Saw the smoke stop, his eyes returned to hers, an unreadable depth in them. Alara found her voice, a dry, reedy sound. My husband. He left weeks ago. It was a half-truth. He hadn't just left. He had abandoned her. The admission tasted like ash. The man nodded, as if her confession was merely confirmation of an already known fact of the wilderness. He shifted the deer, its weight considerable. "Name's Cole," he stated, then gestured with his chin towards the deer. "That's fresh. You got a fire for it?" His words were stark, lacking any preamble or pity. It was a question of practicality, of survival, not sympathy. Her initial fear of him was slowly giving way to a different kind of apprehension, the stark reality of her own helplessness. She had no fire, no way to prepare the meat that was now so tantalizingly close. She could only shake her head, a tremor running through her. Cole's blue eyes narrowed slightly, then he pushed the door wider, stepping over the threshold without waiting for an invitation. The warmth of his presence, the sheer physicality of him, was an abrupt contrast to her own fragile state. He moved with an economy of motion, dropping the deer with a thud that vibrated through the floor. He glanced at the damp which she'd failed to ignite, then at the axe leaning against the wall. "You been out long?" he asked, his voice low. Alara could only whisper, "Weeks." He picked up the axe, testing its balance. "Best get to it then. No sense letting this go to waste." He walked past her, out into the snow, leaving her alone once more. But this time, the cabin wasn't quite so empty. The scent of fresh meat, the promise of warmth, hung in the frigid air. Cole worked with an efficiency that bordered on silent brutality. The rhythmic thud of the axe against wood resonated through the cabin, a strong, steady beat that slowly began to chase away the deathly quiet. Alara watched him from the doorway, her initial wariness shifting into a grudging, then fascinated observation. He moved with a practiced grace, stripping the bark from a fallen pine, splitting logs with a single, powerful swing that made the axe sing. He worked without a word, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his movements purposeful and unhurried. He was a creature of this unforgiving land, as much a part of it as the stoic trees and the enduring snow. Inside, she fumbled with the kindling he brought in, her hands still stiff, but the knowledge that dry wood now existed in abundance spurred her on. The first spark caught, a tiny, tentative flicker that battled against the dampness, then another and another, until a small, hesitant flame danced in the hearth. The heat, even a whisper of it, was a profound luxury. She watched him return, his arms laden with more wood, his face still unreadable, but his blue eyes, as they met hers, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps a recognition of her small victory, perhaps merely an acknowledgement of the fire's potential. He didn't offer praise or even a smile. He simply placed the wood by the hearth and turned to the deer. The methodical process of skinning and butchering was done with the same quiet expertise. He worked with clean, deliberate cuts, separating meat from bone, rendering fat, his hands stained with blood, yet moving with a surgeon's precision. Alara, despite her hunger, had to look away at first, the raw reality of it too stark. But then, curiosity, or perhaps a growing need to understand this man who had so unexpectedly entered her world, drew her gaze back. She watched, learning, absorbing his movements, the way he respected the animal, wasting nothing. He sliced thick cuts of venison, offering them to her on a piece of bark. "Cook it slow," he grunted, then settled near the fire, a silent sentinel. The smell of cooking meat soon filled the cabin, rich and gamey, a fragrance of survival that brought a new kind of tears to her eyes, tears of sheer, overwhelming relief. They ate in silence, the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind their only companions. Each bite was a celebration, a defiant act against the starvation that had threatened to consume her. She risked a glance at Cole. He ate steadily, without greed, his eyes fixed on the flames. He was not a man of many words, but his presence, his actions spoke volumes. He had saved her, not with grand gestures, but with the practical, brutal necessities of survival. Over the next few days he stayed. He didn't explain why, and Alara didn't ask. He hunted, repaired the roof where the snow had caused damage, reinforced the cabin's frail structure. He was a silent force, a guardian against the relentless wild. Alara, in turn, found a new rhythm. She chopped wood, carried water from the frozen creek, tended the fire, her movements growing stronger, less hesitant. The fear had not entirely left her, but it had receded, replaced by a nascent determination. She began to observe Cole more closely, noticing the small things. The way his gaze swept the horizon when he returned, the silent intensity of his focus when tracking, the almost imperceptible softening around his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, after a particularly fierce blizzard had trapped them inside for 2 days, Cole spoke, his voice low, almost a rumble. "You were alone for a long time. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact." Alara nodded, tending the coals. Yes, she didn't elaborate, didn't offer excuses for her husband's desertion. The past was a dead thing. Most folks wouldn't last. He paused, then added, "You did." It was as close to a compliment as she had heard from him, and a small, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. It was a recognition, a validation of her own endurance. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, saw not just a rugged stranger, but a silent, unexpected ally in this harsh, indifferent world. The fragile truce they had forged in the crucible of survival was about to be tested. A week later, a faint, metallic scent pricked the crisp morning air. Not the clean smell of pine or snow, but something tainted, like old iron and desperation. Cole, who had been sharpening his hunting knife by the fire, went still. His head tilted, his eyes scanning the tree line, no longer merely observing, but searching. Alara felt a prickle of unease. He had a way of sensing things, a primal instinct honed by years in the wild. He rose slowly, seamlessly, his hand going to the rifle leaned against the wall. "Stay inside," he rumbled, his voice low, a command that brooked no argument. But Alara, no longer the helpless woman she had been, felt a new resolve stirring within her. She moved to the window, peering out. The snow was pristine, untouched by human footsteps, yet an undeniable tension hung in the air. Cole moved with the stealth of a predator, circling the cabin, his senses alert. He returned moments later, his jaw tight. Tracks, 2 of them. Heading this way, her heart hammered against her ribs. Other men. In this desolation, they were rarely good tidings. Her mind flashed to the stories she'd heard, whispers of desperate trappers, men who had lost their way and their humanity. "Who?" she started, but Cole merely shook his head, his gaze already fixed on the cabin's defenses. "Doesn't matter. We don't ask. We defend." He began to barricade the door with a heavy log, then moved to the windows, pulling shutters closed, plunging the cabin into a sudden, unsettling gloom. The dim light from the hearth became their only illumination, casting dancing shadows that seemed to magnify the tension. Alara did not question him. Instead, she moved to the axe, her hands closing around the cold, familiar haft. The weight of it, once cumbersome, now felt strangely empowering. She had learned to use it to split wood, to provide for herself. Now its purpose was different. Cole watched her, a flicker of surprise in his blue eyes, then a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Good," he said, the single word a quiet approval. They waited. The silence inside was oppressive, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic beat of Alara's heart. Time stretched, an eternity punctuated by the distant, disquieting snap of a twig, the faint rustle of snow. Then, a low, guttural voice from outside. "Close now. Too close. Looks like someone's home. Hope they're friendly." A harsh laugh followed, sending a shiver down Alara's spine. Cole stood before the door, rifle raised, his stance wide and unyielding. His eyes were cold, assessing. Alara stood behind him, the axe clutched tight, her breath held. The knob rattled. A boot kicked the door, sending a shudder through the cabin. "Open up. We ain't got all day." Another voice snarled, laced with impatience and a clear threat. Cole's voice, when he spoke, was a low growl, devoid of fear, laced with a chilling resolve. You take another step, you'll be meeting your maker, a moment of stunned silence from outside, then a scoff. Easy now, old man. We just want a warm fire and some food. And maybe, what else you got in there? The last words were aimed at Alara, a leering insinuation that ignited a fierce, protective fire within her. This wasn't about food or shelter. It was about invasion, about what they intended to take. Suddenly, a figure materialized at the single window, prying at the shutter. Alara didn't hesitate. With a surge of strength she hadn't known she possessed, she swung the axe, not to strike, but to smash the glass, shattering the thin barrier with a crash. The man at the window recoiled with a cry of pain. Simultaneously, Cole fired, the gunshot deafening in the small space, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. A grunt, a heavy thud outside. The second man, startled, stumbled back. "He's got a rifle!" he yelled, his voice laced with panic. "Get him!" Footsteps pounded, retreating. The immediate threat dissolved, leaving behind a sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the wind and the rapid thrum of Alara's pulse. She leaned against the wall, the axe still in her grip, her knuckles white. She looked at Cole, whose eyes, still watchful, now held a newfound respect, a quiet acknowledgement of her transformation. The silence that followed the gunshots was profound, a vast, echoing emptiness that slowly began to give way to the distant wail of the wind and the faint, almost imperceptible groan of the cabin settling back into itself. Cole remained by the door for a long moment, listening, his senses extended to the frigid landscape beyond. He lowered his rifle slowly, his shoulders relaxing, though his eyes remained watchful. He glanced at the shattered window, then at Alara, still clutching the axe, her chest heaving with exertion and the receding tide of adrenaline. "They won't be back," he stated, his voice a low, steady rumble, a stark contrast to the violence that had just erupted. Alara nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with a mix of fear and an exhilarating, unfamiliar sense of power. She looked at the axe in her hands, no longer just a tool for survival, but an extension of her own will, her own defense. The feeling was astonishing, a revelation. She had not merely survived. She had fought. She had stood her ground. Cole moved towards the broken window, examining the jagged shards. "Need to board that up before the night sets in proper." He spoke with the same practical directness, moving on from the threat as quickly as it had appeared. He didn't dwell on the violence, didn't offer comfort or platitudes. He simply addressed the next task. But his gaze, when it met hers, lingered for a fraction longer, a silent communication of respect, of shared ordeal. Alara watched him, her mind slowly unspooling the events of the last few minutes, the last few weeks. The despair she had arrived with, the gnawing fear that had been her constant companion, had not vanished entirely, but it no longer defined her. Something had shifted fundamentally. The woman who had huddled in the corner, waiting for death, was gone. In her place was someone who could splinter glass, someone who would stand by a stranger, someone who would fight for her claim, however small, on this brutal earth. As Cole began to gather wood to board the window, Alara walked to the fire, stoking the embers until they glowed bright orange, a beacon against the encroaching dusk. The cabin, though damaged, still stood. It was still hers, and now she was not alone in it. She looked at Cole, his back to her as he worked, his quiet strength a comforting presence. There were no grand declarations, no promises of a future easy or kind. The wild remained the wild, harsh and unforgiving. But she was no longer a victim of its whims. She was a part of it, forged by its trials. Her past, her abandonment, her profound loneliness, felt less like a wound and more like a scar, a testament to what she had overcome. A quiet dignity settled over her, a deep-seated resilience that had been unearthed by necessity. She had thought herself weak, abandoned, but the truth was, she had always held this strength within her, waiting for the right crucible to reveal it. And Cole, the silent, stoic stranger, had been the catalyst. They had not chosen each other, but necessity had forged a bond far stronger than any spoken vows. It was a partnership born of earth and fire, of survival and mutual respect. As the last rays of sunlight bled from the sky, casting long, stark shadows across the snow, Elara looked towards the horizon. The future remained unseen, shrouded in the vast, white expanse, but for the first time in a very long time, it did not feel like an ending, but a new, hard-won beginning. And she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within her bones, that she would face it, not with fear, but with the quiet, unyielding strength of one who had learned to survive, and in doing so had finally learned to live.